Good morning, David. Lovely to see you down in Minnesota, which here in Canada, of course, we consider to be part of Canada. Sort of the only part of the United States we consider to be part of Canada. Although there are plenty of people here in Alberta that, really are oriented towards Texas. So
Yeah.
and kind of issue.
Well, I wouldn't resist if you wanted to annex us.
Oh, well, that's kind of you. May not want to speak that too loud. So this is our third conversation on Edward Feld's marvelous book of Revolutions, the Book of Revolutions, the battle of priests, prophets, and kings that birthed the Torah. And today, we want to be led into a conversation on the second code. We discussed the Covenant Code, not nearly enough, but maybe when we finish the three of them, we'll come back and do a little bit more. The Covenant Code born out of the desert experience and the realities of that. So today, the Deuteronomic Code, which Feld sketches for us following his sketch of the years of turmoil in Judea, Israel, with the empires of the Assyrians and the Egyptians to the south, also arising at times. So, David, set the scene for us here. This particular code has, as Feld develops or leads us into consideration of it, set the scene.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Feld does that I like very much is been helpful to me is to emphasize the importance of Assyria in this story and in the development even of the language of the Torah, and particularly in the Deuteronomic Code, which is one, the sheer fact of its enormity, its power in the region, and in light of our particular narrative here with the history of the northern tribes, which are named Israel, are just simply dissected into that empire by this ever-expanding empire, by power of Assyria. But we also see evidence of, Feld will point out, the fact of Assyria, its enormity, the absolute power of the king, the enormity, the large statues, everything that so impressed many of the monarchs from the northern kingdom that went up there and were trying to deal with certain kinds of treaties, with them. And that this language also began to filter into the religious language about Adonai. And so we'll come to that, and we'll see it particularly in the Deuteronomic Code, where suddenly it's the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the master of the universe kind of thing, which is a new addition, a different way of thinking about the presence of the divine. And we'll see that borne out in the way the code is written. So I want to emphasize that. And then I want to emphasize that there is this enormous trauma of the loss of these 10 tribes, even though there's not a great deal of love lost, nor necessarily a cohesive identity between the North and the South. I mean, they were often at war with each other and making treaties with different powers. Nonetheless, it's a family.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of exchange between the North and the South, particularly among prophets and priests. And the issues that were arising in the North that we noticed last time with Elijah and Hosea and Amos were really direct confrontation with the powers in the throne room of Israel for not caring for the poor or the widow or the orphan, and also not practicing exclusive worship of Adonai. And for that, they argue, is the reason for what came, which is the excision of the northern tribes and the wholesale deportation of people into the Assyrian world. And that's the so-called diagnosis that is held in the response to this trauma by the South. The reason why this happened, there's only one reason why it happened, is we weren't exclusively worshiping Adonai, and we were not following the moral code embedded in the covenant code, meaning the poor and the sojourner. So the response to that, just the sheer, I can't imagine the trauma of that, although we've certainly seen enough of that in the modern history.
Mm-hmm.
That the response to that, including lots of priests and others coming down, escaping from the north down into the south, and bringing these issues with them into their new home. We began to see these reformers, kind of creating these boundaries, shoring up the loose ends, which the prophets argued, the priests argued, was the cause of the problem. It is that work which takes place, between the reigns of Hezekiah, who was a reformer, and there was an interlude with Manasseh, and then now, why am I blanking on it? Josiah.
Josiah. Yeah.
It's Josiah who really puts this thing to its highest insistence, that now everything must return to the way it ought to be, meaning exclusive worship of Adonai and also the moral code. For this happens because it turns out, and you made mention of it, they find a scroll. There's different stories about that. One is that they're kind of cleaning out the temple, and there's the old scroll right there, intact, not having been read. And it's almost as if Josiah says, no wonder the North blew it. They didn't have the book. But now we have the book, written, of course, over a good period of time, but nonetheless a cohesive scroll, which lays out the way forward and which takes into account the trauma without actually talking about it. I mean, the Deuteronomic Code is written by the same folks who are also writing the histories, probably from Joshua through Kings. And so if we follow along as Feld does with this amazing turbulent history, we're also watching the aggregation of and the revision of the covenant code into what we come to know as the Deuteronomic Code. And that becomes the code. I mean, they really, even if you look in the scroll, there's no reference to other codes. It sees itself as the code, even though there's an oral tradition text in which the covenant code continues to exist, and certainly is the basis upon which the revision is made. We just begin to notice with Feld's insights the particular fingerprint that's on those who are writing in response again to the trauma. I really think we can't underestimate the trauma and that this is a wholesale response, because Josiah's reforms are violent. I mean, there is a purge, and the old sacred places are thrown down, burnt down. People are executed in this very fierce attempt to return to the way things should have been and must be if we are going to continue to be here, to be, in a sense, God's people. And we'll see, Feld will also highlight this, as we talked about in our first session, that there's a repetitive pattern throughout the book of Deuteronomy. Almost in every passage, there is the use of the word land, of command, of voice, of listening, of obeying. Because the problem that they're facing is not one that can be solved by monarchy. I mean, that's, according at least to the Deuteronomic historians, is the monarchy's been the problem. And as you noticed in our first reading, the covenant code is not a dictation from a monarch or a king to a people. It's actually a code that's promulgated for everyone. Everyone's included. There's no distinction between the rich and the poor.
Yeah.
You know. So I would say, and another thing that Feld is holding up here, that, I mean, the project is what to do about succession, because that's been the perennial problem in the history of the kings from the beginning. You know, there isn't, quote, well, all the way back, you know, to the opening of the book of Samuel. Eli's, the prophets, the priest prophet sons are scallywags, and then comes Samuel. You know, I mean, every one of these issues, including between, as Feld is talking about it, between Hezekiah, who's a reformer, and Josiah, who's a reformer, this other son who is reigns for some time and goes back to, quote, the old ways.
Yeah.
In terms of, so we see also in this particular code a preoccupation both with a book that now sits by the king, in which the king must read every day, and that this code is actually a teaching that must be taught. It's connected with even the Shema, as we'll see. When you go in, when you go out, to your children, in order for there to be obedience, it needs to be ever before us. Not something once given and then held and grasped, but something that needs to be learned over and over and over and over again, taught over and over and over again, because it's a generational problem. They can see that.
And also, David, is it not also this image of having to teach it to each generation, or, to put it another way, needing to draw near to it constantly, that is the only way of, and it doesn't ensure, but it gives you some chance of recognizing when idolatries arise,
Yeah.
and kindling your disciplines of discernment around idolatries, because they arise easily in the mind and the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just anecdotally, many years ago, one of my favorite passages, before I really understood what I was reading, but I loved it, was the very end of Deuteronomy, just before the people cross for the first time across the Jordan, and Moses is to go back and die. He says to them, "Don't worry about who shall go up to heaven and get this for you, or who shall cross the sea to bring this home to you. It's already here. It's in your heart, and
Yeah.
it's in your mouth." And that, of course, rings true to our own tradition. That's how we would often speak about the word. And sometimes I thought, well, this is a little like Buddha nature. You know, it's already here. But in fact, what I learned from my Buddhist teacher was Buddha nature may be there, but you need the Dharma. You need the teaching.
Yeah.
And in fact, you take refuge in the Dharma, like you take refuge in the community. You can't do this on your own. You can't do this outside of community, and you can't do this outside of regular study.
And one of the wonderful ways that Martin Buber, your teacher, speaks about how we engage the Torah is that you have the text, but you must open the text in the context of the minyan, in the context of a community.
Yeah.
And because it's a hot text. And if you just read it by yourself, you may think you understand it, and you will not hear the multivalent meanings that are at work in it. And that the text in some ways, I would put it, the text is written by the community for the community and is really discernible in the context of the community.
Yeah.
So in my wing of the Christian tradition, we speak about scripture, holy tradition, which is the long conversation, and ecclesia, the living community. And they're like three concentric circles. And we're in the middle of that. All of those are talking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the dimension of this, which is also present in this particular code more so, is that this is that here we meet the voice that addresses us. Moses may be the one who's translating, but we're being addressed by the one who speaks. And to respond to that voice, I mean, there is a moment in Buber's Way of Man where he goes back to the original debut of human beings in Genesis, where Adam is hiding and Yahweh walks in the garden in the cool of the day, one of the best phrases in all of poetry. And his opening gamut to the human being is, "Where are you?"
Mm-hmm.
And Buber says, everything depends upon whether you turn and listen to the voice.
Yeah.
Well, of course, what happens here, and we'll see it unfold, which is, Buber will also write about this, that we'll take some of the commandments along with us, but we're not interested in the relationship that is the one that's from the one who utters, who speaks the spoken word, So yeah, so we see that there is a program here, Josiah's program. Sometimes Feld calls this the new Constitution, which will enact the policies of Josiah and the reforms for the purpose of securing the nation and the people's identity in the land. I think there's no doubt that that's the centerpiece of this. They're not wanting to go through what the North went through, even though there are plenty of empires now starting to fill in the gap during Assyria's decline. And Deuteronomy is an assurance, really. Again, we'll see it in the text, that if you do this, then we will have a long life in the land. If you don't do this, then the land will be taken away. It's much more forceful in Deuteronomy than it ever was, even though there are hints of this in the Covenant Code, that this is the real thing. I mean, not doing this, not living in this way, will lead to your end. And but in Deuteronomy's mind, it leads to catastrophe, which they've just lived through.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, having said that, we would say that part of returning to the exclusive worship of God also begins to draw distinctions, greater distinctions, between us and them, between we who are the remnant or the Israel, the people of God, and those who are not. And it's like, that reinforcement makes sense given also the fears. I mean, we got plenty of people in this country, as immense as it is, that if too many immigrants come in, we'll lose our identity. It's appalling, but the plain fact is, when people rub up against each other, change happens, and that's the way of things. And there are people who fear that, of course, and don't want the change. And so we'll dig in and create rules or codes around which behavior can be regulated according to who's who. So do you want to go to one of those texts?
Well, just one word about that that was
Yeah.
striking to me this morning when I was rereading the chapters and thinking about how this plays in our world. Part of what leads to this trauma is the way in which engagement unfolded in the North with local traditions.
Yeah.
The kind of adopting of local traditions, and of course the wars that occur, the internecine ones, and also the wars with the empires. And I couldn't help but think, David, how in our world, sometimes there is this, what I think is largely healthy impulse to engage the other. Sometimes that impulse is one which also carries with it an implied denigration of what you have inherited. Doesn't have to, but sometimes these things come hand in hand. The other part of it that was striking is thinking about wars. And, you and I both lived on the west side of Chicago, small Swedish community surrounded by a large Jewish community in the 60s, at the Vietnam War. And then more recently, the struggles which go back to this region. In fact, go even back to Nineveh, Mosul, the struggles around the first Iraq War and the second one as well. And then, of course, Afghanistan. I was so struck when I came back to Chicago after a few years to the old neighborhood, and all of the Jewish community virtually had moved to Skokie or north, and it was Vietnamese. And that was lovely for the food. But Rosenbaum's bookstore wasn't there anymore. You and I, when we were in Chicago, went and visited Rosenbaum bookstore in the north. It was lovely that it made that transition. But what is striking to me is that when we have enemies and when we have wars, it could vary how these are dealt with, but so often we ingest them. We ingest things from the enemy, from who we thought our enemy was. And these days, I kind of wonder, and I want to finish it with that so we get back to the point here. But just as a kind of modern squib on how this unfolds, I sometimes think that in America, because of the wars with Muslim communities in the Muslim world, that there has been ingested in America a strange kind of Islamic element, a kind of Sharia, a kind of way of deeply thinking about us and others in absolutistic terms. So my only point is that this is not an ancient problem. It's very much in our own midst. Yes, let's go to the text.
Well, just to highlight, a large part of your work has been studying the influences of folk traditions and movements of peoples in your own neck of the woods.
Yeah.
Up there.
Yeah.
And we're both grandchildren of immigrants.
Yeah.
And my father was consistently reminding us that we're still in that experience.
Yes.
Even though we think this is ours now, we are at heart immigrants. And I suppose that also has something to do with the way I read these texts. I see what's happening here, and I see what's happening in my own land in the way legislation is proposed, and having to do with how we treat each other. Who has more right? Who has more legitimate authority? Who can speak for the real people?
And who's to be feared?
Yeah.
And what is the disposition one has in the face of that?
Yeah.
And all these three codes are really about that, aren't they? They're about the
Yeah.
disposition. What's
Yeah.
your disposition? What's your posture?
Yeah.
And where is Adonai in it?
Right.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
interesting.
I come back every time I'm in these texts to this underlying question of all interpretation, which is who am I and what am I to do?
Yeah.
Or who are we and what are we to do? And this is a dynamic question. I mean, when you've lost 10 of the tribes into an empire that's vast and overwhelming and is pushing against you, the
Even if you
question,
didn't like them, even if you didn't like their leadership.
even if you didn't like them, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe precisely so, because if that happens to them, what happens to us? And all those questions are just, of course, very present. And we can see the program that they're trying to develop here on the basis, on the basis of the original covenant code, but now reinterpreted for this new situation. And it's one of the things I think Feld does very well. This is a new time, a new era, a new way that we're answering the question. And we should remember, of course, that Josiah's reform is not the only voice that's present. I mean, there are other tendencies within the community that are at work, but that are either suppressed or purged. But they're never completely gone. And there's no doubt those who continue to follow the original covenantal code without necessarily buying into the revision.
And there's this deep dynamic that is so striking. On the one hand, Josiah, Hezekiah, they're dealing with the new situation. They're responding to it. And the response is necessary.
Yeah.
I'm happy to say it's necessary. You have to respond to your time and to the contemporary conditions. At the same time, part of the genius of the Torah. Yes, that's real. Yes, that requires response. But Adonai, the murmuring voice, isn't silent. It's through this. So,
Yeah.
it's a tension, a
Yeah.
real tension. And it's not a tension to be resolved. It's a dynamic tension. It's revelatory tension.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and we know about this too in the contemporary world, and I hear this strain in Deuteronomy, which is, what can we do so that this never happens again? After we say this again after the Shoah, never again a Holocaust, never again after 9/11. This can't ever happen again. We'll never.
Yeah.
Well, there we are.
And if your disposition is shaped solely by that trauma, that is, if the still small voice is not murmuring, if it's overwhelmed by the trauma, if Adonai cannot be heard in the midst of that, if Adonai cannot be heard, then you do not respond to your time, you react to it.
Yeah.
And we have seen that writ large in our own time.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the interesting things about his work, which is, you can react in such a way that you're no longer who you are.
That's right.
And you can give that away in the reaction. The question is, can you retain something here that also can be passed on? And just to put a footnote on that, we'll see, just in my own mind, that much of what we see happening here with the book by the side of the throne,
Yes.
and the king studying the book, will be that element that's passed on that becomes rabbinic Judaism.
So just to make it perfectly clear, the book is found in the temple, but one of the disciplines is that this book, the northern kingdoms didn't have this book. That's why they lost their way. We have the book. So one of the disciplines is you have the book beside the throne. And it's the king's responsibility, as well as priests and prophets, as well as the people. And of course, with the Holiness Code, all this shifts again. But there is a responsibility on behalf of the king to daily meditate, consider, read, engage, listen to what is spoken there by Adonai.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's the most significant shift, and perhaps the most lasting shift, and gift to a community that at one point will really go into exile.
Yeah.
For thousands of years.
So let's walk into the code. Lead us into the code.
So in the covenant code, we read that if you see a donkey, even if it's your enemy or someone who considers you to be an enemy, you have to return the donkey to the owner. And Feld notices that this is about the donkey. It's about not about who owns it. That feels like good old covenant code, in that that's the way common sense seems to have it, when the point of the regulation is the donkey and not the owner. But when we get to Deuteronomy, we find almost the exact text, but with this change. And I read from verse 1. You are not to see the ox of your brother or his sheep wandering away and hide yourself from them. You are to return them to your brother. What's changed? What's different in this regulation? Well, the enemy is missing. And what we have is brother, which is another way of speaking about citizen.
Right.
That's the Hebrew word. So now it becomes, whose ox is it?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily say you shouldn't return it if it's your enemy, but the sense of it is that your obligation is one of neighborliness to your kinsman.
To your kinsman. Right.
And again, you're not to see the donkey of your brother or the fellow citizen or his ox fallen by the wayside. Hide yourself from them. You're to raise it up altogether with him. It's a reinforcement of boundaries and identity and one's responsibility to one's kinsman.
It's phrasing, subtle changes in words make a different world.
Yeah.
I mean, at least they show that there is a different sensibility at work here, a different set of concerns, perhaps even a different set of aspirations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the endless fights that takes place here is, non-citizen immigrants who don't even have a green card go to a hospital. You have an obligation to treat them.
Right. Yeah. I have a curious parallel example from my early work among a very conservative group, fascinating group of Mennonites down in southern Alberta who lived, they had schismed from the old order Mennonites in order to reinstate a number of the disciplines of the church, women wearing prayer bonnets, not taking people to court if they owed you money. They wanted to hold tight to these disciplines, being pacifists, visiting people in prison, all of that. Fascinating group. They really lived up to what Martin Luther called them in the 16th century, married monastics. You know, they lived that kind of community. But a group of them had moved into an area where there was a lot of Danish Lutherans. And these Danish Lutherans were happy Danes. They weren't the pietist Danes. They were Danes influenced by Grundtvig. They were the happy Danes, not the ones that Kierkegaard was, you know, the ones that Kierkegaard was concerned about. So in that area, they all have cattle, and but there's common land, common state land, and that is monitored under a board, and that board is very democratic. Each farmer serves on that board at a certain time. They don't have to do much usually, but once in a while something. So the Mennonites went to the board and said, "Can we graze our cattle on the common land?" "Well, of course you can. You're here, you're neighbors, everybody can do this." And then the Mennonite representative said, "Do we have to serve on the board?" "Well, of course you have to serve on the board. I mean, we all have to do our thing, you know, our little bit." And then the Mennonite said, "Does the board ever take anybody to court?" "Well, that doesn't happen very often, but you know, if somebody's rustling cattle on the area, or if somebody's grazing on it that doesn't belong there, then of course we have to take them to court." Then the Mennonite said, "But it's kind of against our religion to do that, so will you give us an exemption?" They were Danes after all, and rational people. Exemption? Don't be silly. Bring your cattle, serve on the board. These are not big deals. "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't do that." So they never grazed their land there, or grazed their cattle on that. So it's interesting how we think of brother, how we think of neighbor, and of course the echoes of the Good Samaritan narrative here, turning brother to neighbor, turning neighbor to untouchable, and saying that you choose your neighbor. In some sense, you choose your brother. Yeah, it's striking. What about the next?
I mean, without question, the teaching of that parable has these texts right there.
Right there. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
including
everybody knows them.
everybody knows them.
Yeah.
And everybody's, you know, we're talking about a world in which Jesus is teaching these codes that's occupied by a foreign country and has been radically altered by the presence of Hellenism. You know, so I mean, everything is going on here in one place, and a much more, in many ways, a much more confusing place to live than in these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the teaching of who's the neighbor is profound.
Yeah.
So then we see also now in Deuteronomy, you're not to charge interest to your brother. Again, once again, kin. Interest in silver, interest in food, interest in anything for which you may charge interest. This is also very typical of Hebrew writing, where you start a list and then you just go to the end, and that includes everything. As a foreigner, you may charge interest, but your brother you may not charge interest. There's a repetition. In order that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, may bless you in all the enterprises of your hand in the land that you are entering to possess. So once again, as happens throughout Deuteronomy, we not only have the more simple issue, which is who do you charge interest to, but the following of this rule, or this code, has to do with whether or not you're going to be in the land or not. I mean, those are the stakes.
Yeah. I was reminded as I was reading this morning, you know, back in the 70s, I spent a fair bit of time in the Jewish community with my friend, now of blessed memory, Eve Pasco. She was doing work for the Jewish Historical Society. And on one occasion, we talked about this question of usury and interest. And I had this lovely flashback this morning of Eve with a twinkle in her eye saying to me, well, you know, David, we would never charge interest to one of our brothers or sisters in the Jewish community, but to the Goyim, we redeem. We redeem. So it was, this is where it comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And up here, when Muslims moved into like St. Cloud up north, they won't take out a mortgage because they won't pay interest. And so the owners who didn't know what to do simply upped the price of the house. So they actually paid more cash for the house because they wouldn't take out a mortgage. So I don't know what code they're using other than just sheer capitalism, but
And the other echo is, of course, these usury laws existed in the Christian tradition too, up through the medieval period in Roman Catholicism. But popes would have what they called an honest user, you know, a Jew who they could give money to, and then would 10 years later come back and it would be doubled. And they'd do it with their left hand, so they knew nothing about it. There were no documents. But in the Muslim world, to this day, a lot of Muslims, certainly even here in Canada, a substantial number of Muslims still take the usury laws very, very seriously, and will not even have a bank account in which they're given interest. So the legacy of these things, the way they travel into other places, the Prophet Muhammad, for example, there were Jewish tribes in Mecca. So he'd learned about this, obviously, from those tribes as well. And it becomes embodied, reworked within another tradition as well.
yeah. This will come to play if we have time when we get to the sabbatical year, as it plays out then. We should also notice, as I have as a text, so you are to love the sojourner, for sojourners you were in the land of Egypt is what we found in the Covenant Code. It's replicated here, and it has a high place. It's used. It comes back over and over and over again within these promulgations, and within the much of Deuteronomy is Moses preaching within those sermons. So it reminds us that there's a lot that's intact.
Yeah.
In the revision,
So,
and yet then there is these shifts.
So sojourner here. Are you suggesting that it is intact simply the same way it was? I mean, textually, yes. Is there a shift in judgment about who the sojourner is?
I think there is a shift, because sometimes you hear the word, well, as a foreigner, a sojourner, or not. I think at heart here is that as we saw last time, the Covenant Code reinforces this notion that you were once slaves, and that's a fundamental sense of how the way in which I respond to anything is out of this memory. Even after all these years after, I identify myself from my experience, our experience as sojourners in Egypt. So I see it as at least supporting the old identity as expressed in the Covenant Code. And then some of these laws hedge in terms of, what does it mean to love? What are the actual concrete realities of that expression? So it's not a feeling, of course. It's
Yeah.
But it comes to play, for example, in the Sabbath. In the Covenant Code, the Sabbath, Feld points out, and we saw in the text, it's a relatively minor thing. I mean, minor in the sense that not that you can take it or leave it, but it doesn't have its appearance doesn't have the same weight or gravitas that it does when we get to Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomist now will use the Sabbath regulation in order and feed it into the problem of transmission of the code and of identity. And because it will be rooted in that original identity within Egypt. So you have keep the day of Sabbath by hallowing it as Yahweh your God has commanded you. Now this, again, once again, we just start with this word command, and if you follow it through as you read through the book of Deuteronomy, it just is highlighted. For 6 days you're to serve and do all your work. The seventh day is Sabbath for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God. You're not to do any work, not you, not your son, not your daughter, or your servant, nor your maid, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your animals, nor the sojourner that's in your gates. So there's the preservation of that. In order that your servant and your maid may rest as one like yourself. You are to bear in mind that serf were you in the land of Egypt, but Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh took God, your God, took you out from there with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, commands you to observe the day of Sabbath. So, when Deuteronomy is telling the history, except for a very few places, and one of them I left for a final text, this is not Genesis. In the original, more Exodus version of the Sabbath, it's that, Adonai Shabbats, literally, pauses on the seventh day. And so you're supposed to pause too. Here, it isn't creation that promulgates this code. It is the experience in Egypt. And this goes over and over and over again, this reiteration. Don't ever forget this. This is where it all really started. This is how we got to be a people. This is what God did for us. And then it takes us to Sinai and the codes, Moses, everything that's flowing here. The sense of the command is an interesting one, because in the original more covenant code, it's simply saying you can't put them to work. But here you begin to get a sense, and it follows later on, that not only are you giving others rest, but the command is that they should also observe the Sabbath. And this will become a huge issue later on in the story, when after the Babylonian exile, they return and discover all sorts of people living in the land who are stomping out grapes on the Sabbath. And the Jewish winemakers don't like it because they're losing a day, so they got to fight over, do they have to also follow the law? And that's a huge issue also in Israel today. I mean, there are a lot of secular Jews who don't follow the Sabbath. But, as you were speaking about it, do these now become mandates, and are they to everyone? And can you begin to get a feel for the use of the word command, that these are mandates more than you should observe? Which, of course, doesn't mean that it's up to you. I mean, it's still up to you to, follow the command or not. As Buber will say, you can listen to the voice or not. But there's a kind of use of the Sabbath as a structural mechanism to hold together a common use of a day of work, common understanding, a common root, source, or origin of what this day is about, that provides a cohesion to identity. Another way of experiencing, quote, the presence of the book. Here it is. This is what we do. And of course, that continues to this day in many forms.
And it is a way of also bringing about that shift, which is so important. Abraham Heschel speaks about it, that Judaism sanctifies time and is preoccupied with the sanctification of time more so than the sanctification of space. I also wanted, David, when we talked about the covenant code, you made some comments, and I'd like you to return to that and reflect on that in light of this being command. If I recall correctly, you said that the word commandment doesn't even occur in the covenant code.
Right.
That is, this is later and we're here now. Can you just tease up a little bit more the distinction that you're thinking about, that you're walking around there between that earlier code, what we have often read as the commandments, and I think I made the comment about how odd it was to see Southern American judges chisel them into granite and put them in their courthouses. The way in which those are often thought of here nowadays, and certainly within many Christian circles, as laws, as strict laws. Can you just walk around that a little bit more and what you see the shift taking place here, and also say a little more about Buber's consideration that you can refuse to listen?
Yeah. Well, I think it's part of the program. I think of Josiah. The question has always been, so how do you get people to observe these codes? And you can have sanctions. Certainly, you can take people to court. You could probably you can have sanctions around following the Sabbath. There's a variety of ways that can be done. But the language of command is associated with, and I can just say to you here, when you get to, like in the 10th chapter, for Yahweh your God, he is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great God, powerful, awe-inspiring, he who lifts up no face in favor and takes no bribe, providing justice for orphan and widow. I mean, you get this highly elevated language, so that command becomes, Deuteronomy does not like to use the word king for Adonai, but it uses all the other grand language, as if to say, this is we put ourselves under this command in order to actually observe, in order to maintain our place in this land, really, in order to fend off the others. If we don't do the command, then the consequences are dire,
So is it
So
sorry,
go ahead. No.
I just was wondering is it reasonable to say that one of the shifts, even if it's subtle, between the covenant code and the way in which the so-called commandments are spoken of there, is it reasonable to say that within the covenant code, the emphasis was on relationship, whereas here, that is, the emphasis on relationship to Adonai, whereas here the emphasis on relationship through Adonai to the land?
Yeah.
Is that drawing too clear?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you hear the other repetitive pattern, which is here, listen.
Here, listen, yeah.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone. It's a confusing and ambiguous statement at best, which is, I think, it meant to be. But the word to listen and to hearken has the sense of obedience to it in the Hebrew.
Yeah.
You could say, Hear, O Israel, or obey, O Israel, you'd use the same word, Shema. And so command is fitting. What's wanted here is obedience. And rather than being, antinomian, I mean, it's it used to be fun where people said, well, if God says it, it's a command. And that's not the case. I mean, the point is, obedience is one thing, a vow is another. There's also this notion in Deuteronomy that's telling, which is called cling to these words, which is in Hebrew devakut,
Yeah.
which is a devotion. Devote yourself to this.
Yeah.
Yet it's the structure of the book is built around command and obedience.
Yeah.
And we've been around in this within our own tradition, and those who point to quote to see the law in that way, and what Buber will say is, it turns out that if you listen or you don't listen, you don't find a treasure and you're not punished. What you don't have is relation.
That's right. Which is kind of the ultimate punishment, well, not punishment, but tragedy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
I think, and highlighted in much of the teaching of Jesus, but it was kind of a lack of existence, of true existence. It's more like Ezekiel's land of the bones. You got a heart beating, but you're not breathing the air that everybody else is breathing. And so you're not alive.
Not alive. Yeah. And on the sabbatical year, what does
so at the end of the 7 years, you're to make a release. Now, in the Covenant Code, this is a complete release for everybody. And it really is. I just say that. I don't have the text right here, but this is the matter of the release. You shall release every possessor of a loan in his hand, which he has lent to his neighbor. He's not to oppress his neighbor or his brother, for the release of Yahweh has been promised. Now, the sabbatical year is simply a resetting of the economy. It's an attempt to do with people who can't continue to make money off of somebody else's debt. So it kind of creates a new exchange.
But of course, that somebody else is your brother.
Right.
Because that's already been laid out.
Right.
It's not the stranger. It's not the Goyim. It's not the Canaanite.
No, in fact, as follows: the foreigner you may oppress, and he who belongs to you, your serf. As for your brother, your hand is to release him. However, and then there's this sentence: there will not be among you any needy person, for Adonai will bless you in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. Once again, we're back to that formula. If you're going to live in this land and enjoy its benefits, this is the requirement. So you can oppress, and this is a very funny word. I spent some time with this word. Its origin has to do with how you use work animals. It's like driving an ox. You could use this word. And I spent some time with Everett Fox, and he doesn't really flesh it out very, very much, but it can have that layer of meaning that is oppressive. You're not obligated to relieve the debt of the foreigner. And that's a huge distinction in an economy that's increasingly urban, because originally the sabbatical year had to do with land. And we'll see that again in the Holiness Code, where the real point of this is not just to equalize the debt, the ratio of debt, but also to give the land a break, a pause, a breath. Not here. Only if you hearken to the voice of Adonai your God by taking care to observe all this command that I command you. Notice this repetitive pattern.
Yeah.
Indeed, Adonai your God will bless you as he promised you. You cannot read any portion in the Deuteronomic Code without being reminded that everything depends upon your obedience.
obedience, oblate, and relationship, listening, responding. The law as given. Yeah, it's provocative. Provocative. You can see, can't you, how easy it is to, when you don't understand, as Feld is helping us do, and that so much of your work has been about, the overarching narrative and the way these things develop over time. If you don't understand that overarching narrative, and if you don't understand the kind of trajectory of the faith through as it unfolds within holy tradition and as it unfolds through spiritual disciplines, it's so easy to go in and mine and pick out a piece, which then justifies your passion in the face of whatever you're facing. It's so provocative to me. So when you have an understanding of the Covenant Code, an understanding of the Deuteronomic Code, an understanding of the Holiness Code, and how this unfolded in these various epochs of the Hebrew people, it's sobering.
Yeah.
It's just sobering. And it means you can no longer assume that your certainty is the only game in town.
Right.
What ought to happen? Yeah. So.
Right. I mean, that really is where Buber enters into these conversations around law, because what he's saying is that this is not a transaction. There's no assurance that because you do this, you will remain where you are. Jeremiah will say it more poignantly. You keep saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, but the temple of the Lord will be taken away. I mean, this is what happens with empires. And there's a profound and agonizing mystery around these events, like the October 6th butchery of Jews in the kibbutz. People are asking the question, just like people were asking the question now: why did this happen? How did this happen? And the Orthodox have a version of it, and the Muslims some Muslims have a version of it. Hamas has a version of it. I mean, it's, and of course it's the great question that we grew up with theologically following the Shoah, which is how do we talk about this?
Yeah.
But Buber's insistent faith is not about probability.
No.
It's not, doesn't blend itself to a formula, which is if you do this, then you get this.
And it's not about
how the story is lived.
It's not about assurance either, or certainty.
Yeah.
It is about relationship in the midst of all of it.
Right.
In the midst of all of it. So in that sense, it's about what I would call a kind of purified disposition. Yeah. And you have included the final exhortation, Deuteronomy 30.
Yeah, I think it highlights the dramatic language that is placed in this final sermon by Moses, in terms of, even from the beginning, I set before you today life and good, death and ill. And I can feel my good Buddhist teacher saying, yeah, it's always this or that. It's never this or that, but nonetheless, the language is very stark and clear, even if it doesn't necessarily speak to reality. I set before you today life and good, death and ill. In that I command you today to love Yod He Vav He, your God, to walk in his ways, keep his commandments, his laws, his regulations, that you may stay alive and become many, and that Yod He Vav He, your God, may bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. Well, knowing, of course, that the persons writing this are writing this after the destruction of the northern kingdom. So we're going to take, in their rewriting of history, we're going to take this sermon with us and follow it along the whole way. Now, if your heart should face about, and you do not hearken, and thrust yourself away and prostrate yourself to other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you will perish. You will not prolong days in the soil that you're crossing the Jordan to enter, to possess. So I call as a witness against you today, heavens and earth. This is poetic parallelism. It's another way of saying everything. Life and death I place before you, blessing and curse. Now choose life, in order that you may stay alive, you and your seed, by loving Yahweh your God, by hearkening to his voice, by cleaving to him, for he is your life and strength of your days, to be settled on the soil that, and here's one of the first times he ever mentions this, that Yod He Vav He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov, to give them. Here he finally reaches all the way back to Genesis 12. So, land. This land. It is just cemented into the consciousness and identity of this people. If not then, certainly the Deuteronomic writers and the Deuteronomic Code takes great pains to remind everybody that it's about this place.
Land and place. I think of Jacob again. And you referred to this, I think, in our talk last time. And God was in this place, and I did not know. So if we read this final exhortation, is this reasonable, David? To read it with the notion of place and what it means to make place, to be part of the kind of communal creation of place, because there's that which is given in place, but it is also something that we make together, and we make it also in the mystery of Adonai. If we read it through or with the notion of place in mind, and if we read it with the notion of land in mind, is there a play there that's going on?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and there's one of the curious features of this is that, and to go back to that text. So when Yaakov wakes up from the dream, the first thing out of his mouth is, God is in this place, and I did not know it. So he named the place Bethel, house of God. Now, Rashi, one of the great medieval commentators who uses the simple meaning, says, what is it that Jacob means when he says, God is in this place and I did not know it? Wakes up and says, God is in this place and I did not know it. And Rashi says, that's the meaning of waking up.
That's right, yeah.
And so that mystery, and actually Bethel becomes quite a special place of pilgrimage in the north, which Josiah tears down. Because they can't tolerate the notion that these many places around which there has been appearance or presence leaves them out of, in a certain sense, of control of the sanctuary which they focus now entirely in Jerusalem. So these provincial places can no longer operate, and some of those priests were purged and executed.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then there's this notion, and this is in the rabbinic imagination, where the word makom for place is then used to talk about Adonai.
Yeah.
Adonai is makom, is the place. That's really what Jacob discovers.
Yeah.
Wherever he goes, it's not that where he is irrelevant, but it's not the place. It's the presence that is the place.
That's right. And without presence, there is no place. There is only absence.
And that was the confusion that Jeremiah was trying to speak to when he said, you think you're okay because you got a temple and that's the place.
Yeah.
But that's not the place.
And then when Jeremiah writes also to those in captivity and says, pray for the city.
Yeah.
Marry the locals. That is also a way of saying, awake. God is in this place.
Right.
That is presence, the capacity for presence.
And it's why the midbar, the wilderness, is such a powerful, evocative image for this identity.
Yeah.
You know, almost a time when there was real obedience, when we were really following, when we were living by daily bread given to us. And there is a kind of almost a nostalgia in the way Deuteronomy speaks about it. Not in the utopian view that we'll get a little bit more with later Isaiah and the Holiness Code, but a kind of longing for that original relationship that was firm and certain, and where we were completely dependent.
And simplicity.
Yeah. A little like that poem I sent you about Abraham. You know, couldn't we go back to those early days?
Yeah. In order to conclude today, David, would you read the final exhortation again?
This is Moses speaking, so to speak. See, I set before you today life and good, death and ill. In that I command you today to love Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his laws, his regulations, that you may stay alive and become many, and that Yahweh your God may bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. And if your heart should face about, and you do not hearken, you thrust yourself away, prostrate yourselves to other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you will perish. You will not prolong days on the soil that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and to possess. So I call as witness against you today the heavens and the earth, life and death. I place before you blessing and curse. Choose life in order that you may stay alive, you and your seed, by loving Yahweh your God, by hearkening to his voice and by cleaving to him. For he is your life and strength of your days, to be settled on the soil that Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov, to give them. Amen.
Thank you, David. Amen. Lovely. And at our next gathering, you will walk us into the Holiness Code.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
I do too. Lovely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, David.